Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar presented by the Center on Global Energy Policy and the Aspen Institute. My name is Erin Blanton. I'm a senior research scholar at the Center on Global Energy Policy, where I lead the Natural Gas Research Initiative. Today we're going to hear a presentation of the IEA's Global Gas Security Review 2020, followed by a panel discussion on the future for natural gas. Let me first quickly say that this event is being webcast live and the full video will be available online in the coming days. For those of you joining us via Zoom, you can submit a question for the panelists at any time by clicking the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. For those of you watching the live stream anywhere else, you can submit questions via Twitter using the hashtag CJAPLive and our Twitter handle @ColumbiaUEnergy. Our panel today is going to discuss the future for natural gas. Natural gas has been seen by many as playing a strategic role in the clean energy transition, a means to reduce both local air pollution and coal-associated carbon emissions, a way to provide quick ramping, dispatchable power and long-term and seasonal storage, a plentiful, economically attractive fuel that provides a bridge to a decarbonizing future. Yet at the same time, concerns about methane emissions and the overall carbon budget have raised questions over just how long that bridge will be. Tomorrow, the European Commission will release their Methane Strategy, which is expected to offer clear performance standards for natural gas sold in Europe. In the US, the election in just 3 weeks will determine whether the Trump administration will move forward with rolling back methane regulations on the oil and gas sector, or if a Biden administration will reverse those rollbacks. And adding to that mix, China made an unexpected pledge last month to cut its net carbon emissions to zero by 2060. This raises a number of questions. When will global demand for gas recover after the expected record 3% drop in consumption this year? And where will that recovery occur? In all regions or only in certain emerging economies? And how important a role can natural gas have in providing energy access for developing economies? Not only do we need to consider the outlook for natural gas across regions, but also across sectors. Very often when natural gas is being discussed, the power sector is lumped together with the industrial sector and residential sectors, and the outlooks across those will vary widely. The future for gas in producing electric power will not be the same outlook as the future for gas in petrochemicals or industrial process heat. Finally, will natural gas eventually be displaced by hydrogen, and if so, when? And when discussing hydrogen potential, are we talking about blue, green, and gray hydrogen, or should we only be focused on green hydrogen? For today's event, we are going to be able to hear 4 very unique perspectives on these topics. We are joined by Keisuke Satomori, Director of the Energy Markets and Security from the International Energy Agency, who will be presenting the IEA's key findings for the global gas market as part of the Global Gas Security Review, which was released yesterday. Keisuke's presentation will be followed by a panel discussion with Lisa Alexander, Senior Vice President of Corporate Affairs and Chief Sustainability Officer at Sempra Energy, Poppy Kalasi, Director of Global Energy at the Environmental Defense Fund, and Jerome Schmidt, Chairman of the Oil and Gas Climate Initiative Executive Committee. Now I am delighted to turn it over to Keisuke Satomori to present the findings of the IEA's Global Gas Security Review.
Thank you, Erin, for the introduction. Good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you are. Thank you very much for including us in this excellent event. Now, let me start showing the screen. So in the context of the unprecedented crisis triggered by the coronavirus pandemic, this year's Global Gas Security Review is providing a special focus on flexibility and the security of supply during the first months of this year, with an update of gas market report and the short-term forecast, which now becomes a quarterly report. Let me start with the COVID-19 impact on the gas market. So global natural gas demand is forecast to fall 3% year-on-year in 2020. This is the largest recorded drop in global natural gas demand, larger than the 75 BCM drop in 2009 in the aftermath of the 2008 global financial crisis. Most of the declines in gas consumption have been observed in mature markets across Europe, North America, and Asia. The decline was particularly sharp in the first half of 2020 this year, and regional natural gas prices in Europe and Asia reached historical lows. Henry Hub was below $2 throughout the period. Now, some price recovery is underway. Natural gas demand is forecast to increase by 3% year-on-year in 2021, next year. Electricity demand and the industrial activity gradually return, and the presence of abundant and the competitive supply favors further use of natural gas in power generation. Residential heating demand is also assumed to return to normal after an exceptionally mild winter in 2019 to 20 winter. The recovery of global gas demand in 2021 is likely to be supported by fast-growing markets in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. More mature markets should see gradual recovery, and some may not reach their 2019 level in 2021. We are aware, of course, that the resurgence of COVID-19 cases and the prospect of a prolonged pandemic bring further uncertainty to the pace of recovery in 2021. Now, as to the role of the LNG in such a difficult market situation, so faced with an unprecedented 4% year-on-year fall in global gas demand in the first half of the year, the whole natural gas value chain has had to provide flexibility to adjust supply. Although the pipeline gas exporters bore the brunt of the supply side adjustment, the majority of LNG exporting countries also experienced varying degrees of supply curtailment over the first half of 2020. The United States accounted for the biggest share of the downward adjustment in global LNG supply. But it was not the only the United States to experience the significant export declines during the pandemic, as LNG exports fell 16% between January and July. Some producers, such as Qatar, managed to increase production during the pandemic period. So without the flexibility of global LNG supply, one from the United States in particular, the adjustment to the 2020 demand shock would have been less orderly and could potentially have had a damaging effect on the commercial and the contractual structures underpinning the global gas trade. After 2 strong years of contracting activity in 2018 to 2019, the current market uncertainty has put the brakes on contracting so far this year. In 2020 so far, only 35 BCM of contracts have been concluded, and about half the volume of this time last year. So COVID-19 is contributing to a historic demand shock, but the well-supplied market since 2019 is actually a larger driving factor behind this decreased activity. When we examine the contract details in 2020 and compare them with those in previous years, we can see 3 market trends. First, by contrast to the previous several years, in 2020, fixed destination contracts have actually increased, when total contracts have declined. and account for almost 80% of the volumes contracted so far. This is mainly due to the portfolio players who actively seek marketing opportunities to reduce their net buying position by reselling primary volumes to end users with a fixed destination. As for the contract length, a clear orientation toward the shorter term is observed. 2020 also shows a return to smaller quantities with a weighted average of 2 BCM per contract from over 5 BCM in 2019, last year. Let me turn to the change in structure of the LNG supply. This is shown on the screen. Now, going forward, the structure of LNG supply is to be reshaped as about 1/3 of active contracts are due to expire between 2020 and 25, highlighting an unprecedented challenge and opportunity for market participants. Total export capacity is due to increase by 20% from 2020 to 25. And this increase combined with the expiry of 1/3 of active contracts leads to a critical increase in uncontracted capacity, which would grow to 189 BCM by 2025. And this highlights the scale of the marketer's challenge to reach new buyers. As all the fixed destination contracts expire and new flexible contracts enter into force, we see the destination flexible contracts accounting for over half of delivered gas volumes by 2024 for the first time in LNG history. The shift in pricing continues slowly but surely. While contracts with the oil indexed pricing are still dominant in the LNG market, the gas hub linked pricing continues to gain ground. So since the beginning of the crisis, the IEA has engaged with all stakeholders, governments, and the industry to assess the impacts of the crisis on energy markets and security, and to develop roadmaps for sustainable recovery. As part of these efforts, the IEA's natural gas market analysis and the short-term forecast in the gas market report will from now on be updated on a quarterly basis to better track recent developments and further increase the transparency and understanding of energy markets in this unprecedented situation. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Keisuke. As I think you did a wonderful job, just now laying out the challenges that are facing LNG marketers, the impact on investment, what will happen with LNG contracts. I think it's a wonderful way to pivot into the broader discussion about the future for natural gas. And again, for those watching online, my name is Erin Blanton from the Center on Global Energy Policy, and I am here with Lisa Alexander, the Senior Vice President of Corporate Affairs and Chief Sustainability Officer at Sempra Energy, Poppy Kalesi, the Director of Global Energy at the Environmental Defense Fund, Keisuke Satomori, Director of Energy Markets and Security at the IEA, and Jerome Schmidt, Chairman of the Oil and Gas Climate Initiative Executive Committee. We're discussing the future for natural gas and the IEA's Global Gas Security Review 2020. We're now going to move into a moderated discussion. We will open up to questions from the audience in just a bit. So for those of you joining us via Zoom, you can submit a question for the panelists at any time by clicking on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. You can also submit questions via Twitter using the hashtag CJEPLive and our Twitter handle @ColumbiaUEnergy. I would like to give each of our panelists just a few minutes to give their opening thoughts on where they see the future for natural gas, and then we'll go into some of the moderated questions. Lisa Alexander, in your role, you oversee sustainable value creation, corporate social responsibility, and external affairs at Sempra Energy, a utility and infrastructure company with 35 million electric and natural gas customers around the world. You've also previously served in a number of executive roles for Sempra and its companies with responsibilities for market strategy, clean transportation, energy efficiency, research and development, and environmental policy. What is your view of the future for natural gas?
Erin, thank you for the introduction and for the Center on Global Energy Policy's great work in this area. In Kazuke, the IEA leads the world in understanding energy, and this report really helps advance everyone's thinking. So thanks to you and my other colleagues on this panel today. So Erin, you mentioned Sempra's business. As an operator of energy infrastructure, I'd like to start off by offering a perspective that's informed by both macro and micro operating trends. So for context, at Sempra, we develop and own LNG export infrastructure serving global markets. And we also own and operate utility infrastructure, and that includes serving two of the largest economies in the world. California and Texas are respectively the 5th and 10th. So combined, our companies serve the energy needs of more people than any other utility in the US. And our customers include the nation's 2 largest ports, the nation's largest manufacturing hub west of the Mississippi, and some of the most affluent and some of the most vulnerable communities in the country. The average daily natural gas demand supplied by just one of our companies, SoCalGas, is equivalent to nearly 3% of the entire US demand per day, around 2.5 BCF. And at the same time, our electric utilities flow some of the highest renewables in their grids in the country, with SDG&E, San Diego Gas and Electric, averaging over 40%, and Encore through the ERCOT system, over 40% as well. So as an operator, as you can imagine, we wake up every day focused on safety and resilience of our energy networks, as well as the needs of our diverse end-use customers, which include access, affordability, and emissions reductions. So what it means for how we think about natural gas infrastructure is really threefold. Number one, on a global level, it's clear that natural gas helps accelerate the energy transition. Many of you saw IEA's report from the spring that showed that while overall greenhouse gas emissions stayed flat in 2019, that the US contributed the steepest decline in emissions of any country in the world, around 2.9%. And that was coupled with US GDP growth in the same period of 2.5%. So what we know is that natural gas generation plays a key role in this, but that's also coupled with growth in renewables. And it's not a coincidence that they're growing together. So many of you know the more renewables, the more intermittency, and the more we see a need for natural gas or other long-term and seasonal storage for peaking and baseload. So simply put, in our view, natural gas is the natural partner of renewables. Second, what we know as an operator is that while macro trends are instructive, they can mask growing demand on a market or sector basis. And Erin mentioned this earlier, it bears repeating. The market and sector perspectives are essential to understanding the opportunity for natural gas infrastructure. And I'm looking forward to talking about that more later in this panel. But off the top of my head, thinking about the transportation sector, marine, rail, heavy duty trucking is one sector where we see tremendous potential growth for natural gas. Another sector is the industrial sector, where natural gas, coupled with, over time, hydrogen, carbon capture, utilization, and sequestration, is another area where we see continued growth. Finally, I'd just like to note that timing is everything. So now more than ever, as collectively we come together to propel a global recovery from the pandemic, we see great opportunity for a step function innovation in our energy networks, and that includes natural gas. So to that end, this week, the World Economic Forum launched a system value framework, which is a multi-factor, multi-stakeholder view of energy investments that provided a model that governments and others can embrace to think about how to use energy to get out of the current economic situation that we're in. This model takes energy beyond a traditional LCOE perspective, and it considers marginal jobs economic prosperity, emissions reductions, energy access, important issues of social equity in the context of new energy investments. And what this framework tells us is that now is the time to be going long in renewables and digitization and ramping up energy infrastructure in developing nations. And all that includes relying on natural gas to disintermediate dirtier forms of fuel and also help ramp renewables for the future. So if you haven't seen this framework, I encourage you to check it out. So in conclusion, we're not in this conversation to rest on our laurels. Our collective goal is to be ambitious, and very glad, Erin, to you and the Center and the Aspen Institute for convening us here today.
Thank you so much, Lisa. It's much appreciated, and hopefully maybe we can get a link to the WEF report and put that up in the chat function at some point. So I'm going to turn to Poppy Kalassi. Poppy, you lead EDF's energy program in Europe with a focus on delivering ambitious EU policies that will contribute to deep reductions in global oil and gas methane emissions by 2025. You've also previously held roles with the European Commission, the European Parliament, Euroelectric, Statoil, and the Norwegian Ocean Industries. Given your background and your current role, how do you see the future for natural gas?
Thank you, Erin, for inviting us to share some thoughts. And thank you very much, Keisuke and Lisa, for having shared your own perspectives on the issue. I certainly bring a very narrow European perspective to the issue. And I think the overall answer is that I see the future of gas as a very uncertain picture. I mean, looking at Keisuke's slides and considering the analysis that comes out of the IEA, anything is possible from the next quarter and on. However, that being said, as you mentioned, Erin, tomorrow the European Commission is going to publish its EU methane strategy. And what I expect to see is some clarity in terms of, the direction of travel for the gas industry. I expect that for the very first time, we will have fairly clear performance standards in terms of the gas that is going to be sold in the EU's markets. And while it's not a legislative document, it's a strategy. I think we'll start these conversations about, not only what the role of gas is from now until 2030, which is currently challenged in Europe, but also, which molecules we succeed in the EU market, because not all gas will be considered the same. The third question and the third conversation that this is only going to amplify is, can we talk about a European approach to the role of gas? And my sentiment so far is that no, absolutely not. The northwest of Europe has a very aggressive decarbonization strategy, whereas if we look at the east and south of Europe, which are typically more heavily reliant on coal for power, they have a very different view of gas, and they very much see gas as a bridge fuel. However, where I think all parts of Europe align is on how they view gas. And the big change I've seen, certainly since last June, when the political constituencies have changed in Europe, is that we have very definitely passed on to a more opportunistic approach to gas. It is no longer considered a strategic choice, but many governments, including those who, look at gas as a, transition fuel, they look at it as a very opportunistic choice. I think, as I said, with the European Green Deal, the overall architecture and infrastructure of, the European gas markets is also going to change. Everything we do from production to consumption of energy is going to change. And while the vision is radical, we know from past experience with radical visions that Europe is always very ambitious on the region, and the execution is actually going far enough. if very far if we look at renewables. But the fact of the matter is that transitions are not linear, they are not predictable, and they are not uniform. So my expectation is that we will still continue seeing a fairly messy and fluid picture in Europe. We will continue to see the role of gas in the power sector, as you suggested, Erin, being challenged by renewables, both on price, but also, you know, on capacity and availability. But I think the jury is still out on the role of gas in the heating sector and in industry. And this is not only because, you know, of the density of the fuel, but also in the context of the industry, they also have process requirements and they have products requirements that they have to meet. And so in many ways, even though Europe is having a very strong focus on hydrogen as the answer to at least the industrial use of gas, the fact of the matter is that, you know, we are still at a fairly early stage where the onus is on the demonstration of those technologies at scale and you know, pushing those technologies from demonstration to commerciality, which is another job in itself. So I'm afraid I don't have one answer, but rather many answers to the question, and I'm sure all of them are wrong, because the fact of the matter is that I think we're going into a very uncertain period. But what is clear, and certainly in Europe, what will become clearer, starting from tomorrow, is that any fuel will be expected to meet sustainability performance standards. They can be CO2 performance standards or methane performance standards. I expect the next year we'll be hearing more about biodiversity performance. And all of this attention is going to make it very clear on companies, you know, which way they should go if they want to succeed for the next 10 years. And the last piece of the puzzle I haven't mentioned is, of course, the investor angle. While regulation and policy has traditionally been a driver for innovation and change in Europe, so does the investor voice and pressure. And what we see is for the very first time, a coordinated effort to actually engage with sustainability and operationalize it in financial transactions. So all this to say, we are going into an uncertain future, but the one thing that is certain is that CO2 and methane performance is going to be the key differentiator for all fuels.
Thank you so much, Poppy. I think it's so important the way you highlight not only the messiness of a transition, but the differences that happen within a region, for example, within Europe. But I certainly agree with you that Europe has definitely taken the lead, and I think tomorrow will be very interesting to see what's announced with the methane strategy. So thank you so much. And now to our final panelist, Jerome Schmidt. Jerome, the Oil and Gas Climate Initiative is a CEO-led consortium, and it aims to accelerate the industry's response to climate change. OGCI members account for over 30% of global operated oil and gas production, and all OGCI member companies explicitly support the Paris Agreement and its goals. You are personally responsible for advancing and implementing the strategy set by the OGCI CEOs. From that vantage point, how do you see the future for natural gas?
We see a bright future as our friend from IEA is showing. In 2040, natural gas should be responsible for about 25% of the total primary energy demand, when it was only representing about 22% in 2017, and this in the Sustainable Development Scenario. So we see a bright future to the extent we keep improving every day on 4 domains: detection of CH4 emissions, mitigation of emissions, quantification, and reporting. Why? Because we have been, we are, and we will be challenged. We will be challenged on the benefits of gas. And as we are convinced that gas brings many benefits to the climate challenge and is a necessary answer to the climate challenge, we need to demonstrate to our stakeholders, to society, that on these 4 domains, detection, mitigation, quantification, and reporting, we are at the meeting point. And if we do this, we will be able to bring along with us the full civil society. And let's start. First of all, we talk about governments. We talk about policymakers. We need to embark them. We need to make sure that governments include methane target in their indices, include natural gas in their national climate strategy. We need to help them to achieve this. We need to support, and we do support, the implementation of well-designed regulations at the national or regional scale to tackle methane emission reductions. These regulations are necessary. We do believe it. We do as well work with the scientific community, because the scientific community needs to help us to better understand the role of methane emissions on the climate challenge, need to better help us to quantify them on a daily basis. So we are working with the scientific community. And we need as well to work better and better with NGOs, because NGOs will play the drumbeat. NGOs will and can help us to let civil society understand that natural gas is a necessary answer to the climate challenge. Not the necessary answer. It is a necessary answer with renewables, with many others. But to solve the climate challenge, we do believe that there is no silver bullet. So what do we do as OGCI and as oil and gas companies? There are things we can do on an individual basis. Setting CH4 methane intensity targets. This is, for instance, what CNPC has been doing by committing to reduce its methane intensity by 50% by 2025. It is to test and try new detection and measurement technologies. This is what Exxon is doing by testing 8 new technologies on about 1,000 sites in the US. This is to improve our targets by including measurements better and better day after day. This is what BP had committed to do by installing methane measurement technologies on all its major sites. This is when funding methane mitigation projects. This is what Petrobras has announced it would be doing at the scale of $500 million. This is many other things that companies can do on an individual basis. And then there is what we can do on a collective basis. And you know, we have announced a methane reduction target by 2025. We have announced that we would reduce our collective methane intensity from 0.30% in 2017 to 0.25 in 2025, with the ambition to reach 0.2%. And I can tell you, we believe we can be at the meeting point, but we know that we will need to improve our target day after day, year after year, and we will need to improve many things. And in parallel, we will need to keep improving with all the value chain in order to make sure that not only the OGCI companies implement target and do what I have told you, but our peers do it, our value chain do it, producing countries do it as well. Because if we are the only one to do it, we will not succeed.
Thank you, Jerome. I thought that was an excellent summary of what the individual players can do and also what the industry could do as a collective body. I actually would like to open up, as I said, to moderated questions. And I'm going to first go back to you, Jerome, just as a follow-up to this point, which is really sort of what do you think about the speed of which the industry is moving? Is the industry moving at the right speed on these directions? You noted the changing targets for methane emission intensity and such. So I'm interested in how quickly you think the industry is, are they moving at the right speed? And what are the next steps that you think they need to be taking?
The first thing I would say is that if you look at what the industry and in particular our GCI companies have committed to do over the past 2 to 3 years, it is quite remarkable. They are announcing new measures on natural gas, on methane mitigation, almost every month. So I think that the industry and in particular our GCI member companies have in mind that we cannot stop. And there are always rooms for improvement. So what can we improve? For instance, we have a methane target. It is already very low. The weighted average of the GCI member companies is below 0.3%. So it's already close to zero. But we can improve reporting. We can improve measurement. We can help our peers to adopt the same type of targets. We can improve the way we audit. We can work with government in order to develop standards or regulations. We can work with more and more countries in order for them to include methane emissions into their indices. So there is still a lot we can do. And we can improve and increase our effort. And I think we have that in mind. And I can tell you that our role of gas workstream has all what I have just told you about on its table.
Thank you. And I actually think this is a really good segue into a further discussion I'd like to have in terms of your thoughts, the panel's thoughts, on the impacts of improved satellite monitoring and ground-based detection systems. It seems like we have a number of new satellites that are going to be launched in the next few years: Sentinel-5, Methane Sat, Tango. We have, obviously advanced technology happening in ground-based systems. One in particular I was thinking of is Project Astra in the Permian, which is a consortium of Exxon and EDF, GTI, the University of Texas, and Pioneer Resources. And these are all advancements going to what you were noting, Jerome, that will really help impact the tracking and verification of methane emissions going forward. So Poppy, actually, because EDF is so very much involved with all of these issues and the tracking and some of these projects specifically, I want to first turn to you.
Thank you, Erin. So EDF, as you know, is a firm believer that transparency is a driver of change. And of course, satellite technology will enable change both at the policy level, but also at the market level. So my expectation is that what we'll see in the coming years in the gas market and the methane space is very much the same as we saw, with oil stocks a decade ago, when a decade ago, traders would have to pick up the phone and kind of beg for the producers to kind of discuss their oil stocks. They just didn't have to do that after satellite technology became so available. And I think methane emissions are going to be as visible and transparent in the next, certainly by 2025. This is at least the statement that the Copernicus program of the EU has issued. They are stepping up the capability of the Sentinel-5 satellites, as well as the TROPOMI instrument, which is the main instrument the global atmospheric science community is using to detect methane emissions. And these tools are already in orbit. They already do detect methane emissions, but they're only capable to detect the really large blowout events. I think what we'll see in 2025, if the Copernicus program stays on track, is that we'll see more accurate measurements of methane emissions, and certainly EDF's own Methane Sat, which is due to launch in 2022, will come and sit in this ecosystem and in a way talk to Tropomi and zoom in on the basin level. So I think 2025 is going to be a very exciting space, and it's going to be a very different place than where we are now. Increasingly, Copernicus services and output is used not only by regulators and policymakers in Europe, but also, I think, the world. It is also used by citizens. And the third constituency that's going to be empowered by this technology is, of course, the civil society, which in Europe is becoming more and more demanding on transparency and performance. So very exciting times.
Yeah, I would agree with all of those points. I would also say it will be helpful as well, you know, in the investment community and in some of what you were saying about the push from investors to be, you know, really trying to verify our companies following the plans and the pathways that they've set for themselves. And this will really, I think, help in that verification process as well in the investment community, which you noted has really stepped up as a voice towards change, certainly on methane emissions. So I just wanted to go actually back a little bit, and we touched on the outlook for natural gas a little bit in different sectors, but I would like to sort of delve into that a little bit more, because I think it explains a lot about the point, Jerome noted it, that we see natural gas still remain 25% of the overall energy source globally in 2040. And I think this is, a lot of this is a sectoral argument as well as regional. So I kind of want us to touch on that a little bit more. And Lisa, because again, you know, Sempra is power producer, gas utility, and an LNG exporter. I'd like to start with you.
Okay, Erin, so and specifically to talk about that percent of gas that we do envision being a core part of the system through 2040. Yeah, and I think this really does tie to that sector perspective that Erin started off with, which is really essential. So there's a different story for natural gas, first by market, and to use Sempra as an example, if you think about Mexico, natural gas there is being used to create greater energy access with millions of people, and also to offset fuel oil. So we have the dual benefit of reduced carbon emissions because of natural gas, as well as increased resilience and access to energy by so many. In California, natural gas infrastructure is playing a much different role. So there, what we're seeing is natural gas has a very high penetration, over 90% for heating and cooking across the residential sector. And in California, what's happening is the infrastructure is increasingly being viewed as a way to decarbonize. So offsetting fossil natural gas with renewable natural gas from biogenic sources. Recently, the state of California expanded the definition of renewable natural gas to include woody biomass, which has a dual benefit of helping with some of the forest management challenges that we have in the state that have contributed to wildfires. We're also evaluating how the natural gas infrastructure can be used to accommodate higher percents of hydrogen, as they are in Europe, to help with that longer term seasonal storage. So the California market is different than what's being accomplished in Mexico. And again, there, it's about how we use the infrastructure over time to continue to be relevant and help with decarbonization. And then on the LNG export perspective, there it's really a story about two things. Number one, in developing worlds, about supporting resilience and energy security by helping diversify their energy sources. So in the developed world, it's really about that diversification benefit that we think will endure well into the 2040 timeframe. Then in developing worlds, we see a tremendous role for natural gas to offset coal or fuel oil or even dung and or wood. Many of those societies tend to not have great access to energy. That tends to hinder their ability to prosper economically and to achieve greater resilience and self-sufficiency. Natural gas is a cleaner fuel that can help the developing world ratchet up their future well-being and prosperity. So I think that our view really depends on the sector, and we're excited about the potential of natural gas infrastructure to serve all these sectors. But the key thing is that one size really doesn't fit all. And I'd like to reiterate also what Poppy noted, which was relating to the growth of renewables. Something that we continually see, and particularly as an operator, is that the more renewables you have, the more you need some storage solution. And when you're talking about intraday events where there's been a lot of renewables and you have some real significant peaking load that needs to be met, batteries today and the batteries that are conceived of for the midterm future are likely not going to be sufficient to meet that kind of multi-day storage need and certainly seasonal storage need. So even in developed economies that are shifting to renewables, we really see that natural gas in many cases is a natural partner to help bring more renewables online while ensuring that resilience and also helping with a net decarbonization benefit for the energy system. So I think the key thing is we really don't view renewables and natural gas as being either or, but rather they work together with natural gas helping propel renewables and providing that storage function.
Great, thank you so much. I just want to see if any of our other panelists would like to comment on that topic in terms of the long-term outlook. Keisuke, if you had any follow-up thoughts.
Yeah, I agree to the previous speaker's view. We are seeing a very the rapid growth in renewables, and as Lisa said, that the more variable renewables, the more flexibility they're required for the electricity systems. And at this point of time, natural gas is providing the kind of vast majority of the flexibility needed, and also the kind of a storage requirements needed for the entire electricity system. But decarbonizing electricity sector is not enough for the entire the clean energy transitions. So of course, the liquid and the gas energy forms will also need to be used and decarbonized. So in that respect, natural gas, currently the least carbon intensive and the cleanest fossil fuel, will continue to have a very large role to play. And of course, there needs to be an effort to decarbonize the gas itself by introducing the new technologies like hydrogen and also the biomass and biomethane. But there is technological and the cost uncertainty in those new types of gases. So what needs to be done is to make sure that natural gas infrastructure will be maintained so that the energy demands and the energy security requirements are met for the energy system as a whole. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I think that's such an interesting point that you said about infrastructure and maintenance. We have already a number of questions from the audience in terms of gas infrastructure. I'm sort of, just to put a thought out there, I think there is an inherent value in having infrastructure that's already in place. And how to utilize that infrastructure that's already in place when so many of the alternatives require new builds, either transmission, high voltage transmission, or additional pipelines. So I just think that that's sort of an interesting way to think about, how do we utilize the infrastructure that we already have? And of course, a natural discussion point is hydrogen, and how much will hydrogen come into the system? What is technically feasible to be in the pipeline system? And I think as Europe has sort of been, again, at the forefront of this, I'm going to ask Jerome, if you would share your thoughts just to start, and we can all discuss as to what how are OGCI viewing hydrogen? What is the potential for hydrogen to fit into the existing gas system? How do you see hydrogen scaling up? And again, that initial question I asked in the opening comments is, should we be focused on just green hydrogen, or should the goal be ramping up hydrogen, whether it's blue, green, gray? What should the priority be?
I think, yes, thanks a lot. This is a very important question, in fact, your last one. And let's pause for 1 second to look at the facts. Today, about 120 million tons of hydrogen is produced every year. 99% is gray hydrogen, which is produced through and with natural gas. The emissions associated with this hydrogen production are of about 800 million tons of CO2 per year. So it's each time the world produces 1 ton of hydrogen, it produces at the same time in parallel 7 tons of CO2. So we must know that when we talk about hydrogen at the very beginning. So yes, we believe that hydrogen has a bright future and is as well a key part of the climate toolkit. But we need to work on the solutions by order of priority. And the first quick win is to look at the current CO2 emissions of the current production and try to get it down. And the best way is CCUS. And when you look at the cost of transforming methane into hydrogen with CCUS, you are today 2 to 4 times cheaper than if you use electrolyzers with renewables as of today. So the first urgency is, let's try to team up between methane reforming and CCUS in order to produce more and more blue hydrogen at scale, develop the hydrogen industry at scale, and progressively scale it up more and more with, on one side, methane reforming and CCUS, and on the other side, more and more electrolyzers. And over time, thanks to this door, this big door being open with blue hydrogen, the electrolyzers industry will scale up faster. And as it will scale up faster and faster, cost will come down faster and faster as well. And ultimately, hopefully, there will be a cost parity. So that's the way we look at the picture globally. Hence the fact that we look at CCUS project, which could be developed together with hydrogen projects. And we try to look at what could be the infrastructures behind in order to transport this hydrogen and to use it.
Thank you so much. It looks also, Lisa, like there is a hydrogen specific question for you from our audience questions. And it is, do you see Sempra creating value from natural gas by conversion to hydrogen for export?
Well, I think there are a number of paths for Sempra, so let me answer that. But first, I just want to note that just last week, we announced 2 projects to create green hydrogen adjacent to our electric substations. So we're really excited about this because this shows a utility scale opportunity to take the excess renewables and then store it in the form of hydrogen using the electrolysis technology. So stand by for more to see that come online in the 2022 timeframe. But I think that's an example where we're looking at both decarbonizing benefit through the electrolysis and production of green hydrogen, as well as a really important benefit of storage and optimizing renewables and smoothing the supply and demand issues that we have. So when we think about other opportunities for hydrogen, then the question is, do we see, I think, Aaron, hydrogen replacing LNG? Is that what the question is suggesting? Okay.
Yes, as part of, I think it's part of the export.
Yeah, and you know, right now, what we're seeing is that there remains tremendous demand in the midterm for U.S. natural gas to help many of the sectors and global markets that I mentioned earlier, the developing world as well as the developed world, as they seek greater resilience and diversification in their energy supply. So we're not today looking at hydrogen to bring those to the markets. But what I can say is that as we look at our LNG facilities, and this goes back to Jerome's point, emissions management is huge. Most of the emissions for LNG facilities come from compression and in some cases the electricity required to power those. But we also see tremendous opportunity to work with our partners in the value chain, as OGCI is doing, to make sure that we can exert our influence upstream to make sure that the gas that comes through has been produced in a way that is highly efficient and in a way that has best managed for the mitigations throughout, to mitigate the emissions throughout the value chain, so that by the time it comes to the facility, it has been managed as responsibly and efficiently as is possible.
That's great. Thank you so much. I actually think that the question about the demand for US LNG is something I want to go back to, Keisuke, to your presentation, because it really was a fantastic overview of the LNG market and what you see going forward. The thing I thought was particularly interesting is you noted how many contracts are rolling off. A third of all active contracts you have rolling off. And and the report notes that this could be an advantage for buyers for some time. I actually just wanted to know, sort of given some of the resiliency we've seen in global gas demand, especially compared to other fuels, and some of the outlooks we've talked about today for natural gas, do you think that we could actually see some upside surprise to LNG next year and beyond, where that oversupply situation that the IEA is expecting, overcapacity through 2025, could in fact be shortened? I'm just interested in whether you have any potential for upside on the demand front.
Thank you. Yes, of course, there can be an upside, but the buyer's market, or the very well supplied, the market has existed even before this COVID-19 pandemic. And this COVID-19 pandemic's demand shock made things even worse for the seller's perspective. And of course, in the recent past, there was the very sudden change in the LNG market situation with the very rapid increase of the LNG from China, which was driven by policies for the cleaner air, not so much by the market. And so the kind of a similar situation can happen. If the similar thing can happen is a question, but the current situation, I have to say, is a bit different from the past several years because, of course, China still plans to increase the natural gas demand and replace the various demand coming from the coal right now. But somewhat the kind of the low-hanging fruit has been achieved in China. So it could be a bit hard to expect the kind of a similar rate of growth in the Chinese the LNG import. So yeah, of course there can be some upside, and of course if natural gas prices remain low, we can expect a larger number of opportunistic buyers in particular in the South Asian market, for instance. But overall, we expect in general as a kind of a default case that the well-supplied market will continue in the coming years. That's our expectation. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. I just wanted to sort of one more aspect before I open, one more follow-up before I open it up to the many audience questions that we have coming through. And I just wanted to talk about coal because we've mentioned it somewhat, but there seems like there's room for coal to gas switching even within the United States and also within Europe. There's still some potential there. I could start actually with Lisa again, if you don't mind, if you see potential for further coal to gas switching, and then maybe Poppy also get your thoughts on this. And I'm curious as to whether that outlook has changed significantly because of the decline in associated gas and non-associated gas that we're seeing in the US this year. Is that changing that outlook significantly?
So I'll start and just note that I think the recent decline in production is making an already volatile market a little bit more questionable in terms of the trajectory for coal over time. So amidst such dramatic movements in natural gas supply and price, I think it's feasible to expect that some coal-fired demand or generation can step in to meet some of the demand. But in the longer term, our view is that natural gas will definitely come back to its robust growth. And that's because, at least in the US, because of our vast resources and also the policy perspectives, the environmental reasons. Finally, the third perspective, which is key, and we think that supply will come back to where it was, is the cost advantage. So a lot of the shift has really been driven by the economics, and we haven't needed to enforce the environmental as much because the economics have been so favorable. So I guess the short answer is that, in the short term, as the markets remain a bit wonky, we might see some more coal-fired generation be used, but I think over time it's going to shift out and smooth, and certainly the cost, supply cost, and environmental benefits will trend back towards natural gas in this country. I'm curious about Poppy's view overall, and then for the EU too.
So I think we could expect to see a similar picture in Europe, albeit in a different context. As I mentioned before, especially in the east and south of Europe, but also Germany, these are still countries that are quite heavily reliant on coal for their power generation, and all the kind of just transition countries have set themselves quite aggressive coal phase-out plans. And I think from an opportunistic point of view, there will be quite some coal to gas switch this year, and indeed in Germany it's increasing this year. What this means in the medium to longer term, I don't know, and a lot of it will depend both from the continuous development of renewables in the power segment, but when it comes to the heating segments, the other really big initiative that's going to be announced tomorrow is the Renovation Wave. And as you know, Europe has quite a significant building stock of really old, inefficient buildings, and quite high cultures of comfort, which are perhaps one of the main reasons why gas demand and use is so high. I think with the introduction of performance standards in buildings and a more aggressive focus on energy efficiency, I think heating will also start to be challenged as a service for which gas is used. And so in summary, I would see still quite some margin for coal to gas switch in the next 3 to 5 years, but I would have a very big question mark as to what happens after 2025.
That's great. And actually, I'm going to sort of switch us over to some of the audience questions, and I'm going to keep you, Poppy, on for this one because it fits into how do you see nuclear power fitting into the CO2 emissions reductions and the overall energy mix via the natural gas?
Oh, that's a very complex question, actually, and I'm afraid I don't have a simple answer. But other than personally speaking, in my own private personal view, there are countries like France which historically rely on nuclear energy for years, and I think it makes sense to kind of keep using, keep doing what they do for as long as it remains economical and manageable. But building a nuclear infrastructure from scratch in countries that have no nuclear capacity, I think that's a completely different decision. It's a much more strategic decision. And the cost picture is just completely different because it's not only the cost of technology, but it's also building the capability in the country to support a whole industry, essentially. And so I would say for those countries that have nuclear, in many ways, it probably makes sense to keep using it for as long as they can manage the nuclear waste issue safely. But for countries that have no nuclear capacity, I would struggle to see the benefits. But that's, again, my own private opinion.
No, I think that ties into what I was noting about infrastructure that's already in place, right? And it's sort of an inherent value to that, and to the need to build and permit and deal with new infrastructure. And I think that sometimes that also gets overlooked in our discussions of how we see an energy future. I actually had a question in terms of for you, Jerome. Jeffrey Piper asked in our audience questions, there's a lot of discussion of methane emissions. Is industry also addressing the issue of gas flaring? Especially as we noted, there's a big difference between what's being reported and what we're actually seeing as flaring numbers. How is the industry specifically looking at flaring?
I think, first of all, we do look at flaring as part of our methane target. And as you know, the OGCI member companies have launched this year, in fact, a carbon intensity reduction target, which is a 2025 one, which includes as well flaring. So that's the first straight answer. It is part of our priority. The second straight answer is that OGCI member companies have all committed to the aim of the zero routine flaring by 2030 goal. So 2030 zero routine flaring is our aim. This is what we are looking at. And to this extent, we are working together on all what we could do to reach it. And when we engage as part of the Global Methane Alliance or other constituencies, we engage on flaring as well. In addition, what I could say is that as part of OGCI, we are currently working on what more we could do specifically on flaring. This is really part of our agenda. And it is key. It is key not only because it is material, but because it matters for our stakeholders.
Thank you. That's great. Thank you. And actually now I have another audience question that I think I should be directing to Keisuke to start, which is from Michael Ratner, which what are the next steps for a more global natural gas market to be formed? And will it ever be similar to oil? You notice some of the I was thinking this was good because your report notices or focuses on the increased flexibility and the shortening of contracts. So I think this would be a good place to start with you.
It sounds like a very big question. But first of all, due to the kind of a nature of the products, I don't think that the natural gas market will become as global as the crude oil market today. So there would remain some regional aspects because it's not only the LNG but also the pipeline gases. They provide kind of a major portion of the international gas trade. So regional nature would remain. And also, when we take a look at the, for instance, the three regions, US, the Europe, and Asia, even though the COVID-19 situation reduced the kind of regional price disparity of these three regions, but it depends. It depends on the market situation. Of course, there is a very drastic the regional disparity immediately after the big earthquake in Japan, and so there's a kind of there's a somewhat inevitable regional nature in the natural gas market. Having said so, the current kind of a progress development of the more liquid LNG market will bring together the various the natural gas markets around the world. And so the more flexibility we see in the natural gas market and trade, then the more kind of a flexibility and the closer regional the integration of those markets. So with the growth of the flexibility and the liquidity in LNG trade, thanks partly to the U.S. Shale gas revolution. So we are getting closer to the more global nature of the LNG natural gas market. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. So I have a question that I think is probably best directed to Lisa, given Sempra's energy infrastructure investments. How do you from David Leah, how do you counter the argument that building natural gas infrastructure of all types locks in CO2 emissions for the lifetime of that infrastructure?
Well, I think that has been a near-term challenge with some who envision completely moving off fossil at some point, that infrastructure is a way to slow down that transition. And I think what we're seeing is that's actually not necessarily the case. We envision a world where natural gas infrastructure can be used to help with the transition. So whether it's decarbonizing what's flowing through it, again, displacing fossil gas with renewable natural gas, with in the future hydrogen. I think that's one key way to think about it. And with having that natural gas system used purposefully to help other sectors decarbonize themselves. So for example, in generation in California, we could simply not have the amount of renewables flowing through our system today were it not for natural gas storage and peaking generation. So I think there's two different uses for natural gas infrastructure in the utility context. One is that generation resilience, and then the second is how we can use the system to decarbonize to achieve goals. It's the view of SoCalGas, one of Sempra's companies, that in order to achieve California's very aggressive decarbonization goals, that can best and most efficiently be done using natural gas infrastructure and relying on renewable natural gas. And there's a white paper on that on the SoCalGas.com website that walks through that in detail. I think there's been a challenge in our debate about energy policy here in California, and maybe even more broadly, which is that fossil is bad. And I think over the long term, we all agree that we need to address climate change and we have to move off of more carbon intensive fuels. But how we do that is really the key question. And I think that there's more nuance in the conversation than how some might frame it. So using existing natural gas infrastructure is one of the key ways that we see we can decarbonize. Let me give you an example. In the California gas system, 5% of the core throughput of SoCalGas's system is renewable natural gas. And it's renewable natural gas that's directed to the transportation sector, so transit buses and heavy duty trucking. And the interesting thing about the renewable natural gas is that when it's sourced from certain biogenic sources, say from cow manure and cow I'm blanking on the term. When it's sourced from cow manure, that the carbon intensity of that renewable natural gas is minus 200. It's minus, it's negative. It's because it's taking the methane emissions from the air and it's serving the dual purpose of displacing the fossil gas in the system. So we see that potential to not only offset fossil emissions, but also reduce the emissions, in this case, of the transportation sector. And that's been happening for several years here in California. As we think about future natural gas infrastructure, it is in the context of the longer term and with an eye towards reducing emissions. With LNG infrastructure, we know that US LNG can help dramatically reduce global emissions by allowing countries to switch from other dirtier sources of fuel to natural gas. And that's why we believe in that part of our business. And then with our utility infrastructure, we see the dual purposes of decarbonizing the energy system through the natural gas pipeline systems, as well as using the system to help bring on more renewables than we might be able to do otherwise.
Great, thank you so much. Joanne, there are a couple of questions that are really asking about CCUS and what sort of carbon price potentially could we need to really start to accelerate CCUS?
You know, the way I could answer is the following. We have launched a global search to identify the next wave of CCUS hubs across the world. As you may know, OGCI member companies are already developing 5 industrial CCUS hubs, in particular in Norway under the leadership of Equinor, in the UK under the leadership of BP, in the US, in Canada, under the leadership of Oxy, Shell, and others in particular. And we have identified 15 more already across Europe and Canada. And all of them required a marginal CO2 cost of less than $150 per ton. You may think this is very high compared to what we have already on the table, whether it is in Europe or in some places in the US or elsewhere in the world. But we are at the very beginning of this industry. And we need this industry to scale up with many new hubs. And as we scale up, cost will come down. And as the CO2 value will increase one way or the other one across the world, people will put more money on R&D, will put more money to develop new projects, and cost will come further down. So for the beginning of the story, we believe it's not that high.
Okay. That is very interesting. And actually, I'm curious because a couple of questions have come up in the audience Q&A about the corrosive potential of hydrogen. And so switching back to our hydrogen discussion again, and is there a limit or modifications that would need to be made to the pipeline system or infrastructure in order to support hydrogen? So I'm going to open that up to whoever on the panel feels that they can answer, would like to answer this. But I think I've seen some myself. I think I've seen some studies that say you can get up to around 15% potentially in the existing network. But I think that it varies. So I'm interested to see if anyone has any thoughts on what are the technical limitations of putting hydrogen into our existing network.
I can jump in real quick. So by no means am I a material scientist, but I believe in Hawaii, they've actually evaluated up to 10%. I also believe that in the EU that there's been a determination, and Poppy, forgive me, I forget the proceeding, but that a majority of the natural gas pipelines could be used for hydrogen. So I think there's this common vision of the potential. I do know that the Gas Technology Institute and many others are looking really closely at the material science. On one end of the spectrum, it could be that the life of the gas system shrinks. If normally you would need to replace pipelines every, say, 40 years, with hydrogen, you might need to replace at a faster rate because of those effects, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's a non-starter. There's also a number of other material science research projects that are being looked into to understand what kind of coatings could be applied to the system to help mitigate against some of those the hydrogen questions. And then related, this kind of goes back, Erin, to your point about the sectors. So the consequences of using hydrogen in power generation, that's a much smaller problem set and different technologies than if you're talking about using hydrogen for an entire gas distribution network. So I think that's the other overlay is it really also goes back to what sectors the hydrogen is going to be deployed to. And as we're showing with the green hydrogen electrolysis project at our substation here in San Diego, that's a bit more of a, that's more readily available to us in terms of dealing with some of the issues that hydrogen could have to a conventional system than the question of hydrogen flowing through hundreds of thousands of miles of distribution line.
Great, thank you. Oh, Keisuke, did you want to also comment? Oh, you're on mute.
The IEA's hydrogen report also that we released last year also looks into this matter. In addition to this kind of a material science side, there's another element, which is the end use, the equipments, because the percentage of to what extent we can blend the hydrogen into a natural gas system depends on the most sensitive items, they connected to the gas system. So we also need to take that into consideration. Having said so, even if we include low percentage of hydrogen into natural gas systems, if we can blend it to a vast, the high portion of existing natural gas systems, that should surely help the hydrogen use to scale up. Because as Jerome said at the beginning, that at this moment, the scaling up the use of hydrogen is by far the most important element in the promoting the use of hydrogen, rather than the colors of it. So in that respect, blending is a very important kind of has a very important potential for the growth of the hydrogen use in the energy system. Thank you.
Thank you. Actually, Keisuke, I have a follow-up question for you. Some of the comments or some of the questions are asking about the impact of the lack of investment, if that could alter your outlook for the LNG market. You know, the no FIDs this year, could we start to see an impact from that? And sort of a similar question to that, which I think could put together, is how do you see the chance for new oil and gas producing countries in capitalizing on their natural gas resources? Has COVID and what we've seen on the investment front made their chances on moving forward with gas projects significantly less? So it's all about, you know, sort of a little bit more on how you see this impact on investment playing out.
Well, there is a somewhat the kind of a very volatile, the boom and bust nature of this industry. And so the current lack of the FID investment decisions may have the impact on the market in the several years later. But looking at the current market conditions, this demand impact of the COVID-19 will have a long-lasting impact. So we released the gas market report in June, and this version is the kind of the quarterly update to that. But we expect that the COVID-19 impact will last not only next year, but they will impact in the coming 5 years at least. So that's our view. But of course, the lack of investment will the impact in the future years. So there may be the kind of the tighter situation, but at this moment we do not see that in the short term. So that's our the market view.
Great. Thank you very much. There is a question here actually, Jerome, just a simple question on where Jeffrey Rutherford would like to know where people could find more information on OGCI search about the CCUS hubs that you were discussing.
On our website.
There we go.
It was a short answer.
Okay, we'll see if we can get that put up. Just on Lisa, another follow-up for you. There's quite a few questions for you, so I'm trying to pick a few of them. How do you respond to studies that show California's potential for renewable natural gas is only a few percentage of total gas demand and cannot possibly displace more than a tiny amount of fossil fuels?
I think there are many different studies that many different people are familiar with. So I believe that the SoCalGas.com site cites many of the studies that they use in showing that the natural gas system can be essential in achieving California's decarbonization goals. So I would reference people again back to that white paper, and we'll try to track it down, Aaron, and post it to the whole group in real time in this forum. But I believe there are citations there. I think that there's a quick view is that much of the renewable natural gas that is online today comes from landfills, and increasingly it's coming from biogenic sources, you know, like cows and dairies. And I think there's been a misperception that that's kind of the extent of what's possible. But remember that there's a gasification technology that can really take on a lot of woody biomass and harder to process sources. And the view is that there is tremendous amounts of supply that can be derived from that feedstock. And the technology does exist to address it. California's recent law that expands the definition of renewable natural gas to include that woody biomass is really key because, as I mentioned earlier, that's not only about using natural forest waste or products of just the natural reforestation process that occurs to help create renewable natural gas, but it also helps address some of the wildfire issues that we have in the state. So I would suggest looking to the SoCalGas.com report for those sources, and then also remember to consider gasification and non-biogenic sources of renewable natural gas. And I think then you'll see that those numbers will add up to, and my understanding is at least 20%. SoCalGas has a current goal to get to 5% renewable natural gas in the next year or so, and they have a target of 20% by 2030. Remember earlier when I said that SoCalGas supplies about 3% of the United States' entire gas demand per day. 20% of that is a lot. So that's why I say go back to the study and you'll see the studies that do support that feedstock's available. I think the last thing I'll note on renewable natural gas and renewable gases overall is that that's where we also look to power to gas and electrolysis as being a contributor of that supply. SoCalGas had the country's first power to gas demonstration project at UC Irvine. It's super cool. It takes the excess renewables from the campus's electricity system and converts it into green hydrogen that's then stored and used to power other aspects of that campus. And that's an example of another source of renewable gas that we're looking to incorporate into the gas system.
Thank you so much. We're just at the very near the end. There's one more question that I'm going to pose to Jerome, and then I will sign us off. It is a question on how you see the major oil companies' role in financing green technologies to allow a fast energy transition. There is a wide view that they're not committing enough funds. How would you respond to that argument?
You know, each company has its strategy to contribute. And when I look at OGC and member companies, their answer is not the same, depending on where they are from and how they are geared. And I don't believe there is a good and a bad answer. So that's the first point. I mean, some will tell you or me that they want to concentrate on their core competencies and basically remain on the oil and gas business and do it well, do it really well by reducing more and more emissions across their value chain. And some others will tell you that they want to embrace the transition more widely and invest in a very meaningful manner into green energy in order to be at net zero themselves at a certain time for their business model. And I think it is a matter of what is their market, what are the competencies they have, and how they look at their balance sheet and what their investors are asking them. But I don't think one is good and one is bad, provided they all support the Paris Agreement aims and they all contribute to it and they all put everything they can on the table.
Thank you so much. And I will wrap up now and thank you again to our speakers for joining us today in what I thought was a really in-depth and riveting conversation about the future for natural gas. And I want to thank our audience for tuning in as well. And I would like to make a final plug for a commentary that the Center will be putting out tomorrow in conjunction with our partners at TNO, which is the Netherlands Organization for Applied Scientific Research. And it's actually addressing some of the capabilities that are coming out with satellite-based methane detection. It's called Nowhere to Hide: The Implications of Satellite-Based Methane Detection for Policy, Industry, and Finance. So that should be out tomorrow. And as I said, I want to thank everybody and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.